The alarm did not sound like the drills. It came in short broken bursts, the kind meant to wake a person from a dead sleep and put them on their feet before their mind had caught up. I was already reaching for my boots when the second alarm layered over the first, a deeper tone that meant orbital defense, not weather, not a drill, not a mistake. My name is Elena Voss. I was a fleet liaison officer stationed at the Meridian Command Post, a low-orbit station built to watch the sky and talk to whoever came out of it. That night, or what passed for night on the station, the sky had filled with ships that had not been there 12 hours earlier. I pulled on my jacket and ran down the corridor toward the operations deck, my breath tight in my chest. Officers pushed past me in both directions, some still buttoning their uniforms, some already shouting into comm units. Nobody looked at me. Nobody had time. When I reached the deck, the main display told me everything the alarms could not put into words. A wall of ships surrounded our entire planet, not a patrol, not a scout group, an entire fleet, spread out in a pattern too even to be anything but deliberate, forming a shell around Earth like a hand closing slowly around something small. I counted the largest hulls first, out of habit, because that was my training. 12 of them were larger than anything we had ever built, dark shapes with long spines and clusters of light along their sides that looked almost gentle, like lanterns, except I knew better than to trust that softness. Behind them sat hundreds of smaller vessels, locked into a grid so precise it looked painted onto the black of space. Captain Dorian Marsh stood at the center console, his hands flat on the surface, his eyes fixed on the display, like he was trying to make it change through sheer will. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and a voice that never rose even when the room around him was falling apart. I had served under him for 3 years and had never once seen him look the way he looked that morning. I stepped up beside him. "What is happening?" I asked, though the display had already told me the shape of the answer, even if it had not told me the reason. "They arrived 4 hours ago," he said. "No warning beacon, no approach signal. One moment there was empty space, the next moment there was this." Behind us, a young technician named Owen Blake called out that a transmission was incoming, broad spectrum, aimed at every receiver on the planet at once. Marsh nodded once and told him to put it through. The voice that filled the room was calm in a way that felt deliberately built to unsettle. It did not sound angry. It did not sound cruel. It sounded like something reading from a prepared statement it had read many times before, to many other worlds. "This is Ambassador Kes Iridal of the Convocation," the voice said. "We have come to your system in great number because we believe your species poses a danger that we can no longer study from a distance. We do not come to destroy you, we come to contain you, effective immediately. No vessel will leave the boundary of this system. Your defense networks will be disarmed under our supervision. Compliance will preserve your world. Resistance will not change the outcome, only the manner in which it arrives." The room went silent except for the soft hum of the station itself. I looked at the faces around me, at people who had spent their careers preparing for first contact, for trade negotiations, for border disputes with distant colonies, and none of them had prepared for this. None of us had. I turned back to the display and studied the pattern of ships again, because looking at data steadied me in a way that looking at people did not. The formation was not built for an immediate strike. If they had wanted to destroy us, they would not have needed to arrange themselves so carefully around the entire planet. This was a cage, not a weapon, though I understood that a cage could become a weapon the moment its occupant tried to leave it. Marsh ordered a full status check across every defense platform we had, and the reports came back within minutes, each one worse than the last. Our long-range communication arrays were being jammed at every frequency we used for interstellar contact, which meant no distress call would reach any of our colonies or trade partners beyond the system. Our orbital sensors showed a lattice of small devices scattered among the larger ships, buoys no bigger than a delivery shuttle, each one pulsing with a faint energy signature that our systems could not yet identify. I asked Owen to pull a closer scan of one of the buoys nearest to our station. It took him a moment, his hands shaking slightly as he worked the controls, and then the image resolved on a side display. The buoy was a simple-looking device, almost elegant, with 4 curved arms extending from a central core. A thin band of light ran along each arm, pulsing in a rhythm that matched exactly with the pulse of every other buoy in the network, as if they were all breathing together. Marsh leaned toward the image. "What does it do?" he asked, though I think he already suspected the answer would not be simple. "Our best guess," said the station's engineering officer, a quiet woman named Priya Kapoor who rarely spoke unless she was certain of what she was saying, "is that these buoys generate a coordinated field. Individually, they might do very little. Together, tied into a single network, they could bend gravity itself around this system, hard enough to hold ships in place, hard enough to make travel beyond a certain boundary impossible." I felt something cold settle in my stomach as the shape of our situation became clear. They had not come with an army meant to fight us directly. They had come with a cage large enough to hold a planet, and they intended to lock the door and walk away, leaving humanity sealed inside its own solar system, disarmed, watched, and small. Marsh straightened and turned to the room. "I want every available channel monitoring their communications," he said. "I want engineering running every scan we can manage on those buoys without triggering a response, and I want a line open to the surface. The President needs eyes on this before their deadline arrives." I did not ask what the deadline was. I had heard it in the ambassador's voice, the quiet certainty of an ultimatum that did not need to be spoken twice. Comply, or the manner of the outcome changes. I understood exactly what that meant, even if I did not yet know how many hours or days we had before it stopped being a threat and became something else. For the next hour, the operations deck moved like a single organism, every person locked into their task, every voice low and clipped. I split my attention between the sensor readings and the growing list of surface reports flooding in from cities across the planet. People had seen the ships too, of course. You could not hide a fleet that large from anyone who looked up. Every network, every channel, every screen on Earth was showing the same image, the same silent ring of dark hulls hanging above us like a held breath. I stepped away from the main console for a moment and found a narrow window along the outer wall of the station, one of the few spots where a person could actually look outside rather than at a screen. I pressed my palm against the cold glass and looked out at the nearest of the alien ships, close enough that I could make out the texture of its hull, ridged like something grown rather than built. It was strange standing there, not frightened exactly, though fear was certainly present, coiled somewhere under my ribs. What struck me most was the quiet insult buried inside the ambassador's message. They had not come to negotiate. They had not come to ask questions or exchange words the way every other species we had met over the years had done, even the difficult ones, even the ones who distrusted us at first. This fleet had come already certain of what we were: dangerous, feral, a problem to be solved before it grew larger. I did not know, standing at that window, how right they would turn out to be about certain things, and how wrong about almost everything else. Behind me, Owen's voice cracked through the quiet. "Commander," he said, using the informal title people on the deck had started calling me, even though it was not technically mine. "You need to see this." I turned and crossed back to his station. On his display was a countdown, freshly received, embedded in a secondary transmission that had come through moments after the ambassador's speech. It was not long. It gave us hours, not days, before the disarmament was to begin, before convocation vessels would descend into our atmosphere to oversee the process themselves. Marsh read the numbers over Owen's shoulder and exhaled slowly through his nose. "Get me a line to the surface," he said again, his voice flat now, stripped of the calm he had been holding on to since I first arrived on the deck. "Immediately." While the comm team worked, I found myself staring at the countdown, watching the numbers fall, and thinking about every briefing I had ever sat through on interspecies relations, every lesson about patience, about proving ourselves trustworthy to species who had been traveling the stars long before humanity built its first orbital station. None of those lessons had prepared me for a fleet that arrived already having made up its mind. Priya appeared at my side, a data slate in her hand, her expression unreadable in the way that engineers sometimes get when they are working through a problem too large to speak about casually. "There is something odd about the buoy network," she said quietly, keeping her voice below the noise of the room. "It is not just that they are synchronized. It is that they are synchronized through a single shared frequency across every single unit, including the ones mounted on the largest warships. I looked at her, not yet understanding why that detail mattered enough for her to seek me out in the middle of the chaos. Is that unusual? I asked. For a network this large, controlling something as complex as a planetary containment field, she said, it is either a sign of remarkable confidence or a mistake. Normally you would expect redundancy, multiple frequencies, layered protections, so that no single point of failure could bring the whole system down. I felt the first flicker of something that was not quite hope, not yet, but adjacent to it. What are you saying? I asked. I am saying that whoever built this fleet did not expect anyone inside the cage to understand how the lock worked, she said. They built it to be simple because they never imagined we would need to look at it that closely. They built it assuming we would simply comply. Marsh returned to the console just as she finished speaking, his face grim from whatever conversation he'd had with the surface. He looked between us and must have seen something in our expressions because he paused before speaking. What have you found? He asked. Priya glanced at me before she answered, as if asking permission to say something that was still only a fragile thread of an idea. Possibly nothing yet, she said, but possibly the beginning of a way to look at this cage differently than they expect us to. Marsh's eyes moved back to the display, to the countdown ticking steadily downward, to the wall of ships surrounding our entire world. I do not care how small the thread is, he said. Pull on it. We do not have the luxury of waiting for something better to come along. I looked out at the fleet one more time through the narrow window, at the lanterns of light along those massive hulls, at the buoys pulsing together in their careful rhythm, and I understood, in that moment, that whatever happened next would decide far more than the fate of a single negotiation. It would decide what kind of species the rest of the galaxy believed humanity to be, whether we were the danger they feared, or something else entirely, something they had not yet bothered to imagine. The countdown kept falling. Somewhere above us, hundreds of ships waited in their perfect formation, patient and certain, convinced that the cage they had built was already closed. I turned back to the console, to Priya's data slate, to the first crack of light in a lock that was never meant to be examined so closely, and I understood that our answer to Ambassador Kes Iridal would not come in the form of words. It would come in the form of a question they had never thought to ask themselves. What happens when the species you meant to trap decides to study the trap instead of fearing it? None of us on that deck said it aloud, not yet, but I think every one of us felt the same shift in that moment, the same quiet resolve settling into the room like a change in the air pressure before a storm. We were not going to disarm, we were not going to comply. We were going to understand exactly what had been built around our world, piece by piece, buoy by buoy, until we knew that cage better than the people who had built it. The countdown reached its final hour before any of us noticed how much time had passed, and somewhere in that stretch of frantic, focused work, I stopped feeling afraid and started feeling something sharper, something closer to purpose. Marsh must have felt it too, because when he finally spoke again, his voice had returned to its old steadiness, the calm that had carried this station through every crisis before this one. Let them think we are exactly what they expect, he said, watching the fleet hang silent and confident above us. Let them believe the cage is already closed. We are going to spend every hour they give us learning how it opens. I did not know yet how far that thread would lead us, or what it would cost to follow it, but I knew, standing there with the countdown falling behind me, and the whole of the convocation fleet spread out across the sky like a held breath, that humanity had just been handed a question, and that we were not going to answer it the way they expected. We were going to answer it the way we always had, quietly, stubbornly, and together, until the cage they built to hold us still became the very thing that held them instead. The president's face filled the largest screen on the operations deck within minutes of Marsh's call reaching the surface. Her name was Adele Foster, and she had been in office less than 2 years, most of that time spent on trade disputes and colony resource allocation, nothing that could have prepared her for a fleet the size of a small moon settling into orbit around her planet. Even so, Her voice was steady when she spoke, and I found myself grateful for that small mercy in a morning that had offered so few. "Tell me what you know," she said, and Marsh gave her the numbers, the countdown, the buoy network, everything we had gathered in the hour since the alarms first sounded. She listened without interrupting, her expression tightening slightly with each new detail, until he reached the part about Priya's discovery, the shared frequency running through the entire containment lattice. "Can that be used?" the President asked, looking past Marsh toward where Priya and I stood near the secondary console. "I do not know yet," Priya answered honestly. "It is a possibility, nothing more than that right now." "Then find out," the President said, but quietly. "If this ambassador believes we are moving to comply, I want that belief to remain exactly where it is for as long as possible." The channel closed, and for a moment the deck was quiet, except for the low hum of machinery and the distant murmur of report traffic flowing in from stations across the globe. I found myself thinking about the ambassador's words again, the calm certainty in his voice, and I realized I wanted to understand where that certainty had come from. Fear does not appear out of nothing. Somewhere in the history between our two species, or perhaps in a history that involved species neither of us had ever met, something had convinced an entire coalition that humanity was worth caging before we grew any larger. I found Owen at his station, still monitoring the broad-spectrum channels the Convocation fleet used for their internal communication. Most of it was encrypted, useless noise to our systems, but a portion of the traffic used older, simpler protocols, the kind of channels a fleet might use for routine administrative messages that nobody expected an outside party to intercept. "Can you isolate anything from those open channels?" I asked him. "Not their tactical data. Their history. Their reasoning. I want to know why they are so certain about us." Owen worked for nearly 20 minutes before he found something, a low-priority archive channel that several of the smaller convocation vessels used to broadcast what looked like standardized briefing material to newly assigned crew members. It took our translation systems a few more minutes to render it into something readable, but when the text finally scrolled across Owen's screen, I understood immediately why he had gone quiet. The briefing referenced an incident from nearly a decade earlier, a border colony called Halden's Reach, one of humanity's earliest attempts at establishing a foothold outside the solar system. I remembered it only vaguely from history courses, a small settlement that had encountered an unfamiliar vessel during a routine supply run, and, in the confusion that followed, opened fire before either side fully understood what the other was doing. 6 crew members from the unfamiliar vessel had died in that encounter. Our official records described it as a tragic misunderstanding, a moment of fear on both sides that ended in loss nobody had wanted. The Convocation records described it very differently. To them, Halden's Reach was not a misunderstanding, it was proof that humanity would strike first when frightened, proof that our species reacted to uncertainty with force rather than caution, proof that we could not be trusted to expand peacefully into space that other species already occupied. The briefing material referenced Halden's Reach by name no fewer than 11 times, using it as a foundation for nearly every argument about why humanity required careful monitoring, containment, or in the most extreme versions of the document, permanent restriction. I read through the translated text twice, feeling something heavy settle into my chest. It was not that the Convocation's fear was baseless. 6 people had died. Our side had fired first, in a moment of panic that no one, including the crew who pulled the triggers, had ever fully explained to their own satisfaction. But the briefing did not mention the survivors from that unfamiliar vessel who had later testified that they too had raised weapons in that first moment of confusion. It did not mention the years of quiet diplomatic effort that followed, the treaties, the apologies, the changes humanity made to our own protocols to ensure nothing like it happened again. It took one terrible morning and built an entire fleet's worth of certainty on top of it, ignoring everything that came after. I brought the material to Marsh, who read it with the same tightening around his eyes that the President had shown earlier. He was quiet for a long moment before he spoke. "They are not wrong that it happened," he said, "but they have decided who we are based on our worst morning, and they have stopped listening for anything that might update that decision." "That is exactly it," I said, and it means nothing we say to them right now will change their minds. Words will not undo a decade of briefings built on a single incident. If we want them to see us differently, we will have to show them, not tell them. Marsh nodded slowly, though I could see the weight of what I was suggesting settling onto him. Show them how? He asked. I did not have an answer yet, not a complete one, but a shape of an idea was forming, built from Priya's discovery about the shared frequency and from something else I had noticed in the briefing material, buried in a section describing typical human behavior during crisis situations. The convocation analysts had written extensively about our tendency toward public disagreement, toward loud arguments played out across open channels, toward what they called disorganized emotional escalation. They viewed it as a weakness, a sign of a species that could not maintain unified control of itself even in moments that demanded discipline. I looked at that section for a long time, and slowly I began to understand that what they saw as weakness might actually be something we could use. If they expected chaos from us, expected disorganization and public disagreement and visible panic, then perhaps the wisest thing we could do was give them exactly what they expected to see, while doing something entirely different beneath the surface of it. I brought this thought to Priya next, finding her buried in diagrams of the buoy network, dozens of screens open around her, showing every scan we had managed to gather. She looked up when I approached, her eyes tired but sharp. I think I understand the shape of the field they are generating, she said, before I could speak. It is not a single massive structure. It is thousands of small emitters working in unison, each one contributing a fraction of the total force, synchronized through that shared frequency I found earlier. Individually, any one of these buoys is almost meaningless. Disable one, and the network barely notices. But the coordination itself, the timing that keeps every buoy pulsing together, that is the part holding the entire cage in place. If the coordination broke, I asked, what would happen to the cage? It depends on how it broke, she said. If we simply destroyed the buoys, they would likely detect the attack immediately and respond in whatever way their protocols dictate, which I suspect would not go well for us. But if we could somehow interfere with the coordination itself, quietly, without triggering an alarm, the field might weaken, without the network ever understanding why. I told her about the section of the briefing describing how the convocation viewed human behavior during crisis, the public disagreement, the loud emotional displays they interpreted as disorganization. An idea was forming now, clearer with every passing minute. If they expected to see chaos from us on the surface, in our public broadcasts, in our political arguments, in every visible corner of human society, then perhaps that chaos could become a kind of camouflage, a loud and convincing performance that kept their attention fixed on the noise, while quieter work happened in places they were not watching closely. Priya listened, and slowly a small, tired smile crossed her face, the first genuine expression of hope I had seen on the deck since the alarms first sounded that morning. You want to let them watch us argue, she said, while we do something they never think to look for underneath the argument. Exactly that, I said. We brought the idea to Marsh together, and he in turn brought it to the president in a call that lasted nearly an hour, the two of them working through every risk, every possible way the plan could fail, every consequence if the convocation discovered what we were truly doing before we were ready. I sat through most of that call in silence, listening, adding details when asked, watching the weight of the decision settle onto people who had never expected to carry something this large. In the end, the president agreed, though her voice carried a heaviness that told me she understood exactly how much was being risked. We will need everyone, she said, not just the fleet, not just this station, every engineer, every scientist, every ordinary person willing to help, and every one of them will need to believe, at least on the surface, that we are exactly as divided and uncertain as the convocation expects us to be. That will not be difficult, Marsh said quietly. People are already afraid. The disagreement will not need to be invented. It only needs to be allowed to happen where the convocation can see it, while the real work happens somewhere they cannot. After the call ended, I stood at the narrow window again, looking out at the fleet, at the ambassadors' ships hanging in their perfect silent formation, and I thought about Halden's Reach, about 6 people who had died in a moment of fear a decade earlier, about the briefing material that had turned that tragedy into a permanent verdict against an entire species. I thought about how easy it was for fear to calcify into certainty, and how much harder it was to break that certainty once it had set. We were not going to break it with words. The ambassador had made that clear the moment his message reached every screen on the planet. We were going to break it the only way that seemed to matter to people who had already decided who we were before they ever truly looked at us. We were going to show them something they had not expected to find inside the cage, something patient and careful and quietly determined, hidden beneath every loud argument and every visible disagreement that filled the airwaves over the following days. Priya returned to her diagrams, tracing the shape of the buoy network late into what had become, for the station, a very long and sleepless stretch of hours. Owen kept monitoring the convocation's channels, gathering every fragment of information he could find about the fleet's internal structure, their command hierarchy, the vessels that seemed to carry the most authority within the formation. Marsh moved between departments across the station, coordinating with counterparts on the surface, building the framework of a plan that had, only hours earlier, existed as nothing more than a single thread pulled from an overwhelming problem. I found myself thinking, as the hours passed, about the defector Owen had mentioned finding traces of in the intercepted communications, a name that appeared occasionally in flagged internal messages, always followed by warnings and disciplinary notices from Convocation Command. Someone within the fleet itself, it seemed, did not agree with the mission they had been sent to carry out. I did not know yet whether that thread would lead anywhere useful, but I made a note of it, filed it away, alongside every other fragile possibility we had gathered in those first desperate hours. The countdown on the main display continued to fall, steady and indifferent to everything we were building beneath it. Somewhere above the atmosphere, the ambassador and his fleet waited, confident in the cage they believed was already closed, confident in the verdict they had reached about us long before their ships ever entered our system. They believed they understood exactly what kind of species they were dealing with. I intended to prove them only half right, and only for as long as it served us to let them believe it. 3 days passed before the plan had anything resembling a shape we could act on, and every one of those days felt longer than the last. The countdown the ambassador had given us for full disarmament had passed without incident, or at least without the incident we had feared. Instead of descending immediately to force compliance, the convocation had extended their deadline once, then again, and I began to understand that patience was part of their strategy as much as the fleet itself. They wanted us to feel the weight of waiting. They wanted the uncertainty to wear us down until compliance felt like relief. Priya had not left the engineering deck in what looked like more than a day. When I found her there, on the 3rd morning, her console was surrounded by half-finished cups of something that had long gone cold, and her eyes had the glassy focus of someone who had stopped noticing time passing in any normal way. "I think I understand the buoy network now," she said, before I had even fully stepped into the room. "Not perfectly, but enough." She pulled up a diagram that had grown considerably more detailed since the first day, a sprawling map of the containment lattice with thousands of small points of light representing each individual buoy, all of them connected by faint lines showing the flow of the shared coordination signal. "The signal originates from a rotating set of anchor points," she explained, tracing a path across the display with her finger. "At any given moment, a handful of the larger warships act as timing anchors for the rest of the network, broadcasting the coordination pulse that every other buoy synchronizes against. The anchor roll rotates periodically, likely as a safeguard against any single ship becoming a point of failure the network cannot recover from." "That sounds like exactly the kind of redundancy you told me they were missing," I said. "It is redundancy against damage," she said. "Not redundancy against imitation. The rotation only works if every unit trusts the timing signal it receives without question. They built a system that assumes no outside party could ever produce a convincing enough copy of that signal to be mistaken for a legitimate anchor." I felt something settle into place, the shape of the idea Priya had been circling since our first conversation about the shared frequency finally becoming clear enough to hold on to. "You are saying we could build a false anchor," I said. "Theoretically," she said, though her voice carried more caution than confidence. If we could construct a device capable of broadcasting a convincing copy of their coordination pulse, and if we could introduce that device into the network at the right moment, in the right location, we might be able to seize control of the timing signal itself, at least briefly, long enough to do something with it before their systems recognized the imitation for what it was. Long enough to do what, exactly, I asked, though I suspected I already knew the shape of her answer. Long enough to reverse it, she said. If their entire containment field depends on trusting a shared timing signal, then whoever controls that signal controls what the field does. Right now it holds our ships in place and keeps their fleet coordinated. If the signal changed, even briefly, it might be possible to turn that same coordination against the fleet that built it. I sat down slowly across from her, letting the idea settle fully before I spoke again. That would require getting our own device physically close enough to their network to be accepted as a legitimate part of it, I said, not just broadcasting from a distance, close enough that their systems believe it belongs there. Priya nodded, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw real uncertainty in her expression, not about the engineering, which she clearly understood better than anyone else on the station, but about what it would take to actually place such a device where it needed to go. That is the part I cannot solve alone, she said. It would need to be planted directly, likely during some kind of authorized contact with their fleet. A supply exchange, an inspection, anything that would put a person physically close enough to their systems to make the placement possible. I thought immediately of the defector thread Owen had been tracking, the name that kept appearing in flagged convocation communications, alongside warnings and disciplinary notices. I found him a few decks away, still buried in intercepted traffic, and asked him what he had learned in the days since I last checked. "The name is Van Osei," he said, though he corrected himself almost immediately. "That is not quite right. The convocation uses different naming conventions than we do, but our best translation renders it close to that. What matters is the pattern. Every message referencing this individual describes someone who has repeatedly objected to the mission parameters, someone who has argued, through official channels, that the containment strategy was excessive and unnecessary." "What happened to them?" I asked. "Reassigned twice," Owen said. "Reduced in rank once. Still present with the fleet as far as I can tell, though buried somewhere in a support role rather than anything close to command. Whoever they are, they have not been removed entirely, which makes me think their objections carry at least some quiet support within parts of the fleet, even if command has no intention of acting on it." I brought this information to Marsh, along with Priya's plan for the false anchor device, and watched him absorb both pieces at once, turning them over with the same careful weight he gave every decision that mattered. "If there is a path toward physical contact with their fleet," he said finally, "it would need to come through official channels. Something the ambassador himself would agree to, or at least something his command structure would not immediately suspect. We do have something they might want," I said, an idea forming as I spoke it aloud for the first time. "They believe we are disorganized. They believe our surface is chaos and disagreement. If we offered them a formal inspection, an opportunity to see for themselves how divided and uncertain we are, it would fit exactly the picture they already believe about us. It would look like weakness, an invitation born from fear rather than strategy." Marsh considered this for a long moment, and somewhere inside that visit, he said slowly, someone would need to place a device small enough to escape their notice, but precise enough to interfere with a network they believe is beyond our understanding. "That is the entire plan," I said, aware of exactly how fragile it sounded spoken aloud in a quiet room, stripped of the days of careful engineering that had built it. Marsh did not answer immediately. He walked to the narrow window I had stood at myself so many times over the previous days, and looked out at the fleet, at the slow, patient rotation of their coordination anchors, moving through the formation like something breathing in its sleep. When he finally turned back to me, his expression had settled into the same steadiness I remembered from the earliest hours of the crisis. "Build the device," he said, "and find a way to place it in the hands of whoever will be trusted to walk into that fleet." Over the following 2 days, the station transformed into something I had never seen it become before, a place where engineering and diplomacy and quiet desperation worked side by side toward a single fragile goal. Priya and her team worked in shifts around the clock, constructing a device no larger than a data slate, carefully disguised within the housing of a standard diplomatic translator unit, the kind any official visit would reasonably carry. Owen continued monitoring every fragment of convocation communication he could intercept, searching for any sign that our public disagreement, now carefully staged and amplified across every surface broadcast, was having the effect we hoped it would have. That disagreement was not difficult to produce. Exactly as Marsh had predicted, political leaders across the planet argued openly about whether compliance was the safer path. Public figures debated on every channel about the wisdom of resistance against a fleet so vastly larger than anything humanity could field. None of it was entirely performance. The fear was real, the uncertainty was real, and that reality made the theater far more convincing than anything scripted could have managed. Beneath all of it, quietly, carefully, a small group of people continued their work, invisible within the noise. I watched the broadcasts from the operations deck with a strange, hollow feeling, knowing that every argument playing out across the planet's screens was serving a purpose beyond what most of the people involved in it understood. Only a small circle knew the full shape of the plan. Everyone else was simply being human, afraid and divided and loud about it, exactly as the convocation expected us to be. On the 4th day since the fleet's arrival, Marsh received word that the ambassador had agreed to a formal inspection visit, exactly as we had hoped. The request had been framed carefully, offered as a gesture meant to demonstrate humanity's uncertainty and division, an invitation for the convocation to see for themselves how fractured and frightened we truly were. The ambassador's response had come back within hours, brief and clearly satisfied, agreeing to send a delegation to review our compliance efforts in person. I was chosen to be part of that delegation, alongside 2 translators and a small technical support team meant to assist with whatever inspection the convocation representatives wished to conduct. Priya's device, disguised within its innocent housing, would travel with me, carried as casually as any other piece of standard equipment. The night before the visit, I found myself back at the narrow window one final time, looking out at the fleet that had surrounded our entire world for 4 days now, at the buoys pulsing together in their careful rhythm, at the rotating anchors moving through their formation with the patient confidence of something that had never once considered the possibility of being wrong about us. Tomorrow I would walk into the heart of that confidence, carrying with me the first quiet crack in a cage its builders believed no one inside could ever learn to open. The shuttle that carried our delegation toward the ambassador's flagship was smaller than I expected, barely large enough for the 6 of us aboard, and every minute of the approach felt longer than it should have. I sat near the front, the disguised translator unit resting in a case on my lap, and tried to keep my breathing steady while the flagship grew larger in the viewport ahead of us, its dark hull filling more and more of the sky until it seemed to swallow the stars entirely. Beside me sat Grace Bennett, one of the 2 translators assigned to the delegation, a woman with a calm, unreadable face that I suspected had been carefully practiced over years of diplomatic work. She caught my eye once during the approach and gave a small, steady nod, the kind that said she understood exactly how much weight this visit carried, even if neither of us could speak about it openly inside the shuttle. Our pilot guided us into a docking bay large enough to hold a dozen vessels our size, and the moment the shuttle settled onto the deck, I felt the strange, disorienting shift of alien gravity fields adjusting to accommodate us, a faint pressure change that made my stomach turn briefly before it settled. The bay doors opened, and a delegation of convocation representatives stood waiting, tall figures wrapped in draped fabric that shifted color slightly with their movement, their faces unfamiliar enough that I had to remind myself not to stare. Ambassador Kes Iridal stood at the center of the group, exactly as I had expected from the voice that had filled every screen on Earth 4 days earlier. He was taller than the others around him, his posture straight and formal, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same measured calm I remembered, though hearing it directly, without the distance of a broadcast, made it feel far more immediate. "You have come to demonstrate your compliance," he said, more statement than question, his translated voice carrying just enough of an edge that I understood he expected very little from this visit, beyond confirmation of everything he already believed. "We have come to show you where things stand," I said carefully, choosing words that were true without being the confirmation he expected. "Our people are divided about the path forward. I believe seeing that division firsthand may help you understand the situation more clearly than any broadcast could." Something in his expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction, though it was difficult to read expressions on a face so different from my own. He gestured for us to follow, and our delegation moved deeper into the ship, escorted by a small group of convocation officers who kept careful, watchful distance around us at all times. The inspection itself unfolded much as we had anticipated. We were shown records of Earth's public broadcasts, the very disagreements and arguments we had allowed to flourish over the previous days, and convocation analysts reviewed them with the same clinical detachment the briefing material Owen had intercepted suggested they would. They pointed to specific examples of political leaders contradicting one another, of public figures arguing for resistance while others argued for compliance, and each example seemed to settle further into their existing certainty about who we were. "Your species struggles to maintain unified purpose even in crisis," one of the officers said at one point, a shorter figure with a voice that carried more clinical distance than the ambassadors. "This instability is precisely why containment remains necessary. A species this fractured cannot be trusted to expand peacefully." I kept my expression carefully neutral, though inwardly I felt something close to relief at how completely their interpretation matched exactly what we had hoped it would. Every argument they cited as evidence of weakness was, in truth, evidence of nothing more than fear allowed to speak freely, exactly the kind of fear any species might feel when a fleet the size of a moon surrounds their entire world. But they saw only confirmation of a verdict they had already reached long before their ships arrived. As the inspection continued, moving from records review toward a tour of sections of the ship the ambassador clearly intended as a demonstration of overwhelming strength, I began watching for any opportunity that might allow me to slip away from the group, even briefly, close enough to one of the ship's systems to place the device Priya had built. The opportunity did not present itself easily. Every corridor we walked carried at least 2 watchful officers, and every room we entered had been carefully selected, I suspected, to reveal exactly as much as the ambassador wanted us to see, and nothing more. It was Grace who created the opening, though I did not understand what she was doing until it had already begun. Partway through the tour, as we passed through a wide corridor lined with control panels I recognized from Priya's diagrams as connected to the ship's internal systems, Grace stumbled slightly, catching herself against the wall with a small, sharp sound of discomfort. "I am sorry," she said, her voice carrying just enough genuine strain that I understood immediately she had chosen this moment deliberately. "The gravity adjustment. It has not agreed with me." The nearest officer moved toward her immediately, along with one of our own technical support staff, and for a brief window of perhaps 20 seconds, the attention of everyone in the corridor shifted entirely toward Grace and away from the rest of the delegation. I moved without hesitation, stepping toward the nearest control panel, close enough to press my palm flat against its housing, as though steadying myself against the same gravity shift Grace had used as her excuse. The device slipped from my sleeve into my palm in a single practiced motion, exactly as Priya had drilled with me over the previous 2 days, until the movement felt almost natural. I pressed it against the underside of the panel housing, where a small magnetic seal held it firmly in place, hidden from view unless someone specifically searched for it. The entire action took less than 4 seconds, and by the time the officer had finished checking on Grace, I had already stepped back into my place within the delegation, my expression carefully arranged into nothing more than mild concern for my colleague. Grace recovered quickly, offering a small, embarrassed apology for the disruption, and the tour continued as though nothing had happened. I kept my breathing steady, my hands folded in front of me, and did not allow myself to look back toward the panel even once as we moved further into the ship. The remainder of the visit passed without incident, though every minute felt stretched thin with tension I could not allow myself to show. The ambassador concluded the inspection with a final statement, delivered with the same measured calm as everything else he had said, informing us that the convocation would extend a limited period of observation before resuming discussions of disarmament, satisfied, it seemed, that our visible disunity posed little immediate threat to their timeline. We returned to our shuttle without further complication, and it was not until the docking bay doors closed behind us and the ship began its short journey back toward Meridian Command Post that I finally allowed myself to exhale fully, the tension of the previous hour draining slowly from my shoulders. Grace caught my eye again, and this time her carefully practiced calm cracked just slightly, revealing something closer to relief. "That was very close," she said quietly, once the shuttle's cabin systems confirmed we were beyond any range where the convocation might overhear us. "It worked," I said, though I understood the deeper truth beneath those two simple words. It had worked because they had wanted it to work. Every piece of theater we had built over the previous days, every argument allowed to play out publicly, every appearance of division and fear, had shaped exactly the picture the convocation expected to see, and inside that expected picture, no one had thought to look closely enough at a diplomatic delegation stumbling briefly against a gravity shift. When we returned to the station, Priya was waiting at the docking bay, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and barely restrained hope. I confirmed the placement was successful and watched relief wash visibly across her face for the first time in days. "The device is transmitting a passive signal only for now," she explained, walking quickly beside me back toward the engineering deck. "It needs time to fully integrate itself into the rhythm of their coordination network before we can consider activating it as an anchor. If we move too quickly, their systems might notice the imitation before it has learned to blend convincingly with the rest of the pattern." "How long?" I asked. "Days," she said. "Possibly longer. It needs to behave exactly like every other buoy in the network, for long enough that when it finally does something different, their systems will trust it rather than question it." I understood the weight of what she was describing, the strange patience required of a plan that depended on deception sustained not just for a single moment, but for an extended stretch of time, all while the very real disagreements and fears playing out across the planet's surface had to continue believably, convincingly, without ever revealing the quiet work happening beneath them. That evening, I stood once more at the narrow window along the station's outer wall, looking out at the flagship where Priya's small device now sat hidden within a control panel, slowly learning to breathe in rhythm with a network built by people who had never imagined anyone inside their cage would learn to speak its language back to it. We had planted our answer inside the heart of their certainty, disguised as nothing more than a moment of weakness, exactly as they expected. Now all that remained was patience, and the slow, careful work of teaching a lie how to sound exactly like the truth they already believed about us. The days that followed the inspection were the hardest of the entire crisis, harder even than the first morning when the alarms had torn me from sleep. There was no single dramatic moment to carry us forward, only the slow, grinding patience of waiting while a hidden device learned to imitate a network built by people who had never once questioned their own certainty. Priya monitored its integration constantly, watching for any sign that the convocation systems had noticed the imitation among them, and I split my time between the operations deck and the surface, helping maintain the careful appearance of division that continued to unfold across every human broadcast. On the 6th day since the fleet's arrival, Owen intercepted a communication that stopped the entire operations deck cold. A routine security sweep had been ordered across several sections of the ambassador's flagship, including the corridor where our device remained hidden. The order gave no specific reason, and for several hours we had no way of knowing whether it was simple routine maintenance or the first sign that something had drawn suspicion toward exactly the panel where Priya's device sat waiting. I stood beside her console, watching a live feed Owen had managed to intercept from the flagship's internal security network, grainy and incomplete, showing officers moving methodically through the corridor, pausing at intervals to run scanning equipment across the walls and control panels. My hands were pressed flat against the edge of the console, and I realized I was holding my breath as the officers approached the section where the device was hidden. "If they find it," Priya said quietly, not looking away from the screen, They will know within minutes that someone tampered with their network. Everything we have built collapses the moment that happens. The officers paused directly in front of the panel. One of them ran a scanning device slowly across its surface, and I watched the readout flicker on a secondary display Owen had managed to pull partial data from. Numbers and patterns I could not fully interpret, but that made Priya's shoulders tense visibly beside me. For nearly 30 seconds, nothing happened except the slow sweep of the scanner, and then, without any visible reaction from the officers, they moved on, continuing their sweep further down the corridor, as though nothing unusual had registered at all. I exhaled slowly, feeling my pulse pounding in my ears. "What just happened?" I asked. Priya did not answer immediately, her fingers moving quickly across her own console, pulling data from the device's passive signal to check its status. "The device is designed to mimic the exact energy signature of the surrounding buoys," she said finally, her voice carrying relief mixed with lingering tension. "Their scanner was looking for anomalies, deviations from the expected pattern. As long as the device continues behaving exactly like everything around it, it will not register as anything worth investigating further. We had been fortunate, though I understood that fortune alone could not be trusted to carry us through however many more days remained before the device finished its slow integration into the network's rhythm." That evening, Owen brought me something else entirely, a fragment of encrypted communication he had spent hours working to partially decode, one that referenced the same flagged individual he had identified days earlier, Van Osei, the officer whose repeated objections to the containment mission had earned reassignment and quiet disciplinary action. "I think this message was meant for someone specific," Owen said, showing me the decoded fragment on his screen. "It uses phrasing that does not match standard convocation administrative language. It reads more like someone reaching outward, testing whether anyone might be listening who is not part of their own command structure." I read the fragment carefully, a short passage that spoke, in careful and guarded language, of doubt regarding the mission's necessity, of concern that the fleet's approach risked provoking exactly the outcome it claimed to be preventing. It was not a confession of disloyalty, not exactly, but it carried an unmistakable undertone of someone searching for another way forward, someone who did not believe the cage around our world needed to remain closed as tightly as the ambassador insisted. "Can we respond?" I asked. "Carefully," Owen said. "If this is a trap, or if Van Osei's loyalty has been tested by their own command and found wanting in a way that leads back to punishment rather than genuine doubt, any response we send could expose everything we are trying to protect. But if it is real, this could be the first thread we have found that leads to someone inside that fleet who might actually help us." We brought the fragment to Marsh, who weighed the risk carefully before authorizing a response, brief and carefully worded, offering nothing that could be used against us if the message proved to be a trap, but leaving open the possibility of further contact if Van Osei's doubts were genuine. The response we crafted spoke only in general terms, expressing hope that understanding between our species might yet be possible, careful enough that even if intercepted by Convocation Command, it would read as nothing more than diplomatic sentiment. 3 days passed before any reply came, 3 days during which Priya's device continued its slow integration, and the surface of the planet continued its carefully staged theater of disagreement and fear. When the reply finally arrived, it came through the same fragile channel Owen had first identified, longer this time, more direct, written by someone who had clearly decided the risk of honesty outweighed the safety of silence. Van Osei confirmed what the earlier fragment had only suggested, a genuine and long-standing doubt about the wisdom of the containment mission, built not from sympathy toward humanity specifically, but from a broader concern about the Convocation's pattern of behavior toward species they judged dangerous based on limited evidence. The message described, in careful detail, the internal debates that had taken place before the fleet's departure, debates in which a minority voice, including Van Osei's own, had argued that overwhelming force applied preemptively was as likely to create the very enemy it claimed to prevent as it was to neutralize a genuine threat. More importantly, buried within the careful diplomatic language, was a piece of information that made Priya sit forward sharply the moment Owen finished translating it. The rotation of coordination anchors within the buoy network followed a predictable cycle, one that Van Osei, in a support role connected to fleet logistics, had access to and was willing to share. Knowing that cycle in advance would allow us to time the activation of our own hidden device with far greater precision. Choosing the exact moment when seizing control of the coordination signal would carry the least risk of immediate detection. "This changes everything," Priya said, already pulling up her diagrams of the network, cross-referencing the timing information against the device's current integration status. "If this information is accurate, we could know almost exactly when our device will be trusted enough by the surrounding network to act as a legitimate anchor, and we could choose the precise moment when the fewest active countermeasures would be watching for exactly this kind of interference." I thought about the risk we were taking, trusting information from someone we had never met, someone whose loyalty could shift again, under pressure we could not see or predict. But I also thought about the briefing material Owen had first uncovered, the way an entire fleet's certainty had calcified around a single incident from a decade earlier, and I understood that Van Osei represented something the convocation itself had tried to suppress within its own ranks, a willingness to question a decision everyone else had already accepted as final. We continued exchanging careful messages over the following days, building a fragile trust between two people who would likely never meet in person, working together across a divide neither species had ever successfully crossed before. Priya used the timing information to refine her calculations, narrowing the window during which activation would carry the greatest chance of success, while I continued the difficult work of maintaining the surface theater that kept the convocation's attention fixed exactly where we needed it. On the 11th day since the fleet's arrival, Priya called me to the engineering deck with an urgency in her voice that carried none of the exhaustion I had grown used to hearing over the previous days. "The device is ready," she said the moment I stepped through the door. "Its integration is complete." According to Van Osei's information, the coordination anchor rotation will reach a point within the next 36 hours where our device would sit at the center of the timing cycle rather than the edge of it, giving us the strongest possible position to attempt what we have been planning. I looked at the diagrams spread across her console, at the small marker representing our hidden device, now woven seamlessly into a network built by people who still believed, as far as we could tell, that the cage around our world remained exactly as secure as it had been the morning their fleet arrived. "Then we tell Marsh," I said, "and we tell the President, because in 36 hours we are no longer going to let them believe the cage is closed. We are going to show them what happens when the thing you build to hold someone still learns to hold you back instead." Priya nodded, and for the first time since the crisis began, I saw something in her expression that was not exhaustion or fear, but something closer to quiet, steady resolve, the look of someone who had spent 11 days solving a puzzle no one had ever handed her the answer to, and who now understood, finally, that the answer had been sitting in her hands for longer than she realized. 36 hours, she said, and then we find out whether 11 days of careful, patient work is enough to answer a fleet that arrived already certain of who we are. The final hours before activation passed, with a strange, heavy stillness that felt entirely different from the frantic energy of the crisis's first days. Every preparation that could be made had been made. Priya's calculations had been checked and rechecked by a small team of engineers who understood, by then, exactly how much weight rested on a plan that had grown from a single fragile thread into something that now touched every corner of the station's operations. Marsh had briefed the President one final time, and I had spent the last of those hours simply sitting beside Priya's console, watching the countdown she had built to mark the precise window Van Osei's information had identified. "I do not think I have asked you directly," I said quietly, somewhere in the final stretch of waiting. "What happens if this fails?" Priya did not look away from her console, though her hands stilled briefly over the controls. "If the device is discovered before activation, or if the timing window proves less precise than we believe, the most likely outcome is that the convocation strengthens their network immediately, closing whatever vulnerability we exploited before we ever get another chance to find one. Beyond that," she said, her voice quieter now, I do not know how they would respond to discovering deliberate interference with their systems. I do not think any of us know exactly how far their patience extends once it runs out. I thought about Halden's Reach, about 6 people who had died in a moment of fear a decade earlier, and about how completely that single tragedy had shaped everything the Convocation believed about humanity ever since. I understood, sitting there in the final hour before activation, that failure would not simply mean returning to where we had started. It would mean confirming, in the clearest possible terms, exactly the verdict the ambassador had already reached about us. Proof that we were dangerous, proof that we could not be trusted, proof that the cage had been necessary all along. "We are not going to fail," Priya said, as though she had followed the same thread of thought, to the same uncomfortable place I had. "Not because I am certain of the engineering, I am not completely, but because we have spent 11 days building something patient and careful in a place they never thought to look. And patient, careful work does not simply fail because the stakes are high." The countdown reached its final minute, and the operations deck grew quiet in a way I had not heard since the first alarm sounded on that first terrible morning. Marsh stood at the center console, his hands flat against its surface exactly as they had been that first day, though now his expression carried none of the shock from that morning, only steady, focused attention. "Activation window open," Priya said, her voice carrying across the silent deck. "Initiating signal transfer now." I watched the display where her device's status indicator sat, a small point of light among thousands of others representing the buoy network stretched across the sky above us. For a moment, nothing appeared to change. The countdown reached 0, and the deck remained silent, every person present holding their breath in the same way I had held mine days earlier, watching a security sweep pass dangerously close to Discovery. Then the display began to shift. Across the diagram of the containment lattice, the pattern of pulsing light that had remained perfectly synchronized for 11 days began to fracture, slowly at first, then with increasing speed, as the false timing signal Priya's device now broadcast spread outward through the network, buoy by buoy, ship by ship, each one trusting the coordination pulse exactly as it had been built to do, never suspecting that the pulse itself had changed hands. "They are losing synchronization," Priya said, her voice tight with focus, as she watched her own readings confirm what the main display was already showing. "The field is destabilizing, not collapsing entirely, not yet, but the coordination that held their formation and our containment together is coming apart." Across the room, Owen called out that Convocation communication traffic had spiked dramatically, dozens of vessels broadcasting confused, urgent messages to one another, clearly attempting to understand why their carefully synchronized network had suddenly begun behaving in ways their own protocols could not explain. I watched the main display as the pattern of ships that had surrounded our planet for 11 days began, for the first time, to show visible disruption, small drifts in position as individual vessels lost the precise coordination that had held their formation so perfectly still since their arrival. "Now," Priya said, and I understood immediately what she meant. This was the moment Priya's plan had been building toward from the very beginning, the point where control of the network's coordination signal did not simply disrupt the Convocation's formation, but redirected the very force that had been used to hold Earth in place. "Reversing field polarity across the affected sector," she said, her fingers moving quickly across her controls, executing a sequence she and her team had rehearsed dozens of times over the previous days, without ever knowing for certain it would work as intended. "The gravity lock that has held our world in place for 11 days is about to hold something else instead." The main display shifted again, and this time the change was unmistakable. Across the section of the fleet nearest our station, ships that had moved freely through their formation only minutes earlier began to slow, their engines still active, but their movement growing sluggish, constrained, as though something invisible had reached out and closed a hand gently but firmly around each vessel in turn. Within minutes, the disruption spread further, following the same network pathways that had once carried the Convocation's authority throughout their entire fleet, now carrying something else entirely. Owen's voice cut through the quiet deck, carrying a note of disbelief. "Their entire formation is losing independent maneuverability," he said. "I am reading dozens of vessels reporting engine and navigation failures simultaneously. This is not isolated to the sector near our device. It is spreading through the whole network. I watched the display in something close to awe, understanding, finally, exactly what Priya's careful engineering had accomplished. The buoy network's design, the same shared coordination that had made it strong enough to hold an entire planet in place, had also made it vulnerable to a single point of trusted control seizing that coordination and turning it inward. What had been built to project overwhelming unified force had become, in the span of a few short minutes, a cage of its own, closing not around Earth, but around the very fleet that had arrived so certain of its own strength. A new transmission broke through the station's comm systems, and I recognized the voice immediately, though it carried none of the calm certainty I remembered from the ambassador's first broadcast. Ambassador Kes Iridal's voice was tight, urgent, stripped of the measured confidence that had filled every screen on Earth 11 days earlier. "This is Ambassador Kes Iridal," the message began. "We are experiencing a critical failure across our coordination network. All vessels are reporting loss of independent control. We demand to know what has been done to our systems." Marsh looked toward me, and I understood, in that moment, that the response to this message would matter as much as everything Priya had built to make it possible. I stepped toward the comm console, my hands steady despite the pounding of my own heart, and opened a channel back to the flagship. "This is Elena Voss, speaking on behalf of Meridian Command Post," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. 11 days ago, your fleet surrounded our world and told us that resistance would not change the outcome, only the manner in which it arrived. I would like you to understand something, Ambassador. The manner has changed. You built a cage, assuming no one inside it could ever learn to understand how it worked. We spent 11 days proving otherwise. Silence stretched across the channel for several long seconds before the ambassador's voice returned, quieter now, carrying something that had not been present in his first broadcast, something that sounded unmistakably like the beginning of doubt. "What is it you intend to do with this?" he asked. I looked around the operations deck, at Priya still monitoring the spreading disruption across the fleet's network, at Marsh standing quiet and watchful beside the main display, at Owen tracking the confused, urgent traffic flooding every convocation channel as their entire armada came to understand, all at once, that the cage they had built now held them instead. "I do not know yet," I said honestly, because in that moment, standing at the edge of a decision far larger than anything I had ever been asked to make, I truly did not. But I promise you this, Ambassador, whatever we decide, it will not be decided out of the same fear that brought your fleet here 11 days ago. We are going to take the time to choose carefully." The channel remained open, carrying only silence from the other end, and above us, spread across the sky in a formation that had once seemed unbreakable, hundreds of ships sat still and quiet, held in place by a cage of their own making, waiting to learn what kind of species had finally, patiently, turned their certainty back upon them. The hours that followed the activation were unlike anything I had experienced during the entire crisis, a strange, suspended stillness in which the greatest advantage humanity had ever held over another species sat quietly in our hands, waiting to be used or set aside. Across the operations deck, and in similar rooms across the planet, the same question moved through every conversation, spoken in different words but always circling the same center. Now that we held the cage closed around them, what were we going to do with it? Marsh called the president within minutes of the ambassador's silence, stretching unanswered across the open channel, and within the hour, a wider call had been assembled, government leaders from across the planet joining together in a conversation none of them had ever expected to have. I sat near the edge of that call, present at Marsh's request, though I said little during the early portion, listening instead to the range of voices arguing for very different paths forward. Some argued for using the advantage fully, disabling the convocation fleet permanently, ensuring that no force of that size could ever threaten our world again, whatever the cost to the ships and crews now trapped within a network they no longer controlled. Others argued for caution, for using this moment only long enough to force a genuine negotiation, one built on equal footing rather than the one-sided demands the ambassador had delivered 11 days earlier. The arguments grew heated at times, And I found myself thinking, with a strange, quiet irony, that this disagreement, unlike the theater we had staged so carefully over the previous days, was entirely genuine, humanity once again proving exactly as divided and uncertain as the Convocation had always believed us to be, except this time, nothing about it was performance. It was the President who finally brought the conversation to its center, her voice cutting through the competing arguments with the same steadiness I remembered from our very first call, 11 days earlier. "We have spent this entire crisis being told what kind of species we are," she said. "We have been called dangerous, feral, a threat requiring containment, based on a single tragedy from a decade ago that we have never been given the chance to explain, or apologize for, or move beyond. We now hold the power to prove them right about every fear they carried into this system. I would like to suggest that we use this moment instead to prove them wrong." I felt something settle in my chest as she spoke, a recognition of exactly the thought that had been forming in me since the moment Priya's device first fractured the Convocation's careful synchronization. We had spent 11 days convincing an entire fleet that we were something we were not, chaotic and divided on the surface, while patient and careful work happened underneath. Perhaps the final and most important part of that same strategy was to show them something true now, something that could not be staged or performed, a genuine choice made with restraint rather than force, even when force was fully within our reach. The call continued for nearly 2 more hours, working through the details of what such a choice would actually require. Priya, brought into the conversation to explain the technical realities, confirmed that the containment effect on the Convocation fleet could be maintained indefinitely if we chose, but could also be released gradually, in a controlled manner that would restore their independent systems without exposing our own network to retaliation in the process. It was not a simple binary choice between total control and total release. There was a path between them, one that would require both patience and courage in equal measure. "I want to speak with the ambassador directly," I said, near the end of the call, surprising myself slightly with how certain my own voice sounded. "Before we decide anything final, I think it matters that we are honest with them about why we are choosing what we choose. Not to ask permission, to make sure the reason is understood." Marsh looked toward me, and after a brief exchange with the President, the call ended with agreement that I would open a direct channel to the flagship, carrying the framework the group had spent the last 2 hours building. I returned to the operations deck and found it quieter than it had been in days, the frantic energy of the crisis settling now into something more deliberate. Priya stood near her console, ready to adjust the containment field the moment the conversation with the ambassador reached its conclusion. I opened the channel, and after a brief pause, Ambassador Kes Iridal's voice returned, quieter and more measured than it had sounded in the hours immediately following the activation, though still carrying an unmistakable wariness. "Commander Voss," he said, using a title I had never formally held, but had apparently earned in his eyes over the course of the crisis. "I assume you are calling to inform us of your intentions." "I am," I said. "Your fleet arrived 11 days ago and told my entire world that we would be contained because you believed us too dangerous to be trusted with our own freedom. You based that belief on an incident that happened a decade ago, one your own records describe in detail, while leaving out everything that came after it, the changes we made, the years of care we took to ensure it never happened again. You built an entire mission around a single terrible morning, and you never once asked whether the species who lived through it had grown beyond it." The channel remained open, silent on the other end, and I continued, choosing each word carefully, aware that this conversation would likely be remembered, on both sides, for far longer than the 11 days that had led to it. "We now hold your fleet exactly as you held our world," I said. "We could keep it that way indefinitely. We could use this moment to ensure the Convocation never again considers containing another species without first understanding who they truly are. But I do not believe that is who we want to be, Ambassador, and I do not believe proving your fears correct would serve either of our species in the long run. We are going to release your fleet. Not because we lack the ability to do otherwise, because we believe restraint, chosen freely when the alternative was fully within reach, says more about a species than any show of force ever could." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I began to wonder whether the ambassador intended to respond at all. When his voice finally returned, it carried none of the calm certainty from his first broadcast 11 days earlier, replaced instead by something quieter, something that sounded, for the first time since his fleet arrived, genuinely uncertain. "Why?" he asked simply. "Because someone within your own fleet believed this mission was a mistake before it ever began," I said, thinking of Van Osei, of the careful, guarded messages that had made the last critical days of our plan possible. Because 6 people died at Halden's Reach a decade ago, and we have spent every year since then trying to make sure their deaths meant something more than fear repeating itself. Because the easiest thing in this moment would be to become exactly what you already believed us to be, and the harder, better thing is to prove that fear does not have to be the last word between 2 species who have barely begun to understand each other. I nodded to Priya, and she began the careful, gradual process of releasing the containment field, restoring independent control to the convocation fleet 1 section at a time, exactly as the plan required, giving the ambassador and his crews time to confirm, ship by ship, that their systems were returning fully to their own command, rather than being released all at once into a chaos none of us wanted to risk. Over the following hours, as the fleet slowly regained its full independence, I remained at the comm console, watching the formation above us begin to shift for the first time in 11 days, ships drawing back gradually from the tight perimeter they had held around our world, forming instead into a looser gathering that suggested withdrawal rather than continued siege. The ambassador's voice returned once more before the last of the fleet prepared to depart, quieter still, though something in it had changed in a way that felt, cautiously, like the beginning of something other than fear. "We will report what happened here to the Convocation Council," he said. "I do not know what conclusions they will draw. Perhaps this changes nothing in the wider view held of your species. But I will report it honestly, Commander Voss, exactly as it happened, and I will not omit what you chose to do when the outcome was entirely in your hands." "That is all I would ask," I said. The fleet withdrew fully over the following 2 days, hundreds of ships departing our system in a formation far less imposing than the one that had arrived 11 days earlier, and I watched from the narrow window at the station's outer wall as the last of them faded from view, the sky above Earth finally empty again, for the first time since the alarms had first torn me from sleep. I do not know, even now, exactly what the wider galaxy will eventually come to believe about humanity, whether the story of these 11 days will travel far enough or carry enough weight to soften the fear that a single tragedy at Halden's Reach had planted so deeply within an entire coalition. I know only what I witnessed directly, a species capable of patient, careful work in the quiet places no one expected us to look, and capable, in the moment that mattered most, of choosing mercy when the far easier choice would have been to prove every fear correct. We were called feral once, dangerous, a species better held in a cage than trusted to walk freely among the stars. Perhaps we are still learning, even now, exactly what we are, but I believe, standing at that window and watching the last of an alien fleet disappear back into the dark, that we proved something worth remembering in those 11 days, something I hope reaches further than any single broadcast or briefing ever could. We do not need to be the most dangerous thing in the galaxy to be taken seriously. We only need to be the kind of species that, given the power to become exactly what others fear, chooses instead to become something better.